Human activities impact the environment, either positive or negative. This study focuses on the negative impacts of human activities, particularly in flora. This video will discuss how the biogeochemical cycle, the nitrogen and sulfur cycle, the anthropogenic effects, epigenetics, and how invasive species lead to degradation that could affect flora and become a threat to the environment.
For the discussion on flora, our focus will be on the nitrogen and sulfur cycles. What makes these cycles different from other cycles, like the commonly known water cycle, is that the elements involved in these cycles aren't transferred through direct methods. Starting with the nitrogen cycle, plants specifically can't absorb nitrogen directly from the atmosphere. So how exactly does the cycle work? Bacteria takes nitrogen and it goes through three steps. First is ammonification, then it goes through nitrification, and finally denitrification. The nitrogen gas is taken from the atmosphere and turned into ammonia, which is then processed by nitrifying bacteria and turned into nitrites. These nitrites eventually turn into nitrate, which is the form of nitrogen that can be absorbed by plants. Once the nitrogen is turned into nitrate, these plants will take the nitrate and use it to grow. The continuation of this cycle is when the animals consume these plants. So, from the atmosphere, the nitrogen goes into the plants through various processes to turn it into the sap form needed to absorb them, and then these plants are consumed by animals. And once those animals decompose, it once again goes through ammonification, and then it goes through the bacteria once again until it denitrifies and turns into nitrogen gas and goes to the atmosphere once again. The whole process is carried through bacteria, which is why nitrogen is difficult to cycle through the earth. An important factor that connects the nitrogen cycle to the flora of the earth is that nitrogen is a nutrient that plants need. Moving on, sulfur is another element that is essential to plants as it contributes to the protein and enzyme functions of plants. When sulfur is cycled through the earth, it is primarily passed through rocks as stored sulfur and is released through weathering. The released sulfur is eventually converted to sulfate from its exposure to air, or it could be dissolved in water and is eventually absorbed by plants. Once the sulfur reaches the plants, it is then passed on to various organisms and is ultimately released and returned to the atmosphere after those organisms die and decompose. With these two biogeochemical cycles, plants receive nutrients needed for growth and development and other important functions.
The human species are biodiversity's greatest threat. With the exponential growth of the human population comes the duty to satisfy their infinite demands.
This results in the rapid decline of many species, including plant life. Human population is linked with the species richness in a specific area. By the beginning of the industrial period, there has been a huge development in human activities and technology to fulfill their needs and improve the quality of life. The irony that lies in this scenario is that these methods can negatively affect our way of living. Examples include nitrogen and sulfur fertilization that are used to further vegetation's growth, and coal combustion powered by fusels or power plants, which has been a long-standing energy source here in the Philippines.
Nitrogen oxide, with its high concentration level, injuring the plant, decreasing its growth and yield, and sulfur dioxide, where it disrupts the photosynthetic mechanism, causing the plant to lose its water component. Nitrogen toxicity increases the salt in it while taking away the water, making the plant dehydrate and kill itself. While a sulfur toxicity does is make the nutrients unbalanced, giving too much acidity, making the plant growth decrease.
Invasive species is a serious threat to the biodiversity ecosystem, and it can also harm the wildlife in so many ways. Invasive plant species has been reported that besides of colonizing areas and replacing the natural vegetation, it can also cause various health problems and environmental degradation. The examples of invasive plant species that has negative impacts are the water hyacinth or the water lily. As we all know that it causes flood when it is rainy days. Hyptaje benghalensis. It causes locally severe damage to the indigenous riparian habitat and the edges of the cleared woodland. And lastly, Lantam camara. It's a poisonous flower that can kill horses, buffalo, sheep, and goats.
Invasive species does not always equate to being harmful in our environment, but we can also benefit from these invasive species. So, what are the benefits or advantages of the flora?
It maintains ecological balance. Humans cannot exist without flora. Plants are responsible for producing oxygen. Without it, we wouldn't have water, which is essential in every living being's survival. Aside from respiration, they become resources for food and medicine. 90% of medicine used to cure diseases are prepared from herbs. Plants play a vital role in the food chain as producers in distributing energy throughout the ecosystem. According to tourism, Amazon flora captivated numerous scientists and explorers. Study shows that they contribute about $50 million to the Brazilian economy. Similar countries, particularly from the topics like Caribbean, Bahamas, and Panama, draw a lot of tourists due to their exotic wildlife and greenery. Invasive species bring devastating impacts on the locations they are situated. One of the biggest factors is the worldwide loss of one's habitat. There are instances in which the flora and fauna both introduced as invasive for simply disrupting the balance of the native ecosystem they are located. When foreign species of plants establish themselves in local ecosystems, consequences are that they will outcompete and displace local species in their habitat. The effect of this invasive species can affect us by degrading the soil, which can lead to erosion and reduce the quality of water. There are also instances in which they can be a crowd and kill important tree species that serves as a habitat and carbon storage for native wildlife.
As plants don't bloom or flower until spring, people need an alternative to make it grow faster. In the process of epigenetics, specifically for flora, it helps to speed up the flowering or fruiting of plants by treating seed or seedlings as to induce a shortening of its vegetative process or period. It involves changing in gene functioning that do not involve changes in its DNA sequence. The rise of epigenesis can also help the agriculture and the environment to regenerate plants. It can be a good alternative for the reason that it can be an approach to enable high-impact science and maintain advancements in its complex traits.
However, there are also negative impacts of epigenetics on flora. Plants may face biotic and abiotic stresses that may cause extreme temperature that affects its nitrogen and sulfur cycle, which then leads to drought, chemical toxicity, and some nutritional deficiencies. The process of epigenetics for plants is considered a highly dynamic process because it creates developmental conditions that utilize for developing and improving varieties of plants.
Other solution alternatives reveal that many chefs from around the world are searching for these said species and are utilized as substitute ingredients. The best way to fight these invasive plants is through prevention. Avoiding introduction of these species to new environments can prevent the spread of these plants from sabotaging the area's local condition.